The Resident Evil franchise is really cooking right now because we now have a pretty clear picture of Capcom's potential roadmap for the series. We already know that Capcom is working on multiple Resident Evil projects, and thanks to various reports and leaks, we have plenty of information about what could be coming next. So, today, we're going to break down the current Resident Evil roadmap, starting with Resident Evil Code Veronica Remake, then moving through Resident Evil 0 Remake, Resident Evil 1 Remake, and eventually Resident Evil 10. Obviously, keep in mind that some of this information comes from reports and leaks, so none of the details should be treated as officially confirmed unless Capcom announces them. With that out of the way, let's get into it. First up, we have Resident Evil Code Veronica Remake, which is currently rumored to be targeting a 2027 release. If the reports are accurate, this will be a full remake of the original Code Veronica, bringing back characters such as Claire Redfield and Chris Redfield, while returning us to Rockford Island. And honestly, this could potentially be one of Capcom's most ambitious Resident Evil remakes yet. Code Veronica is particularly important because it continues Claire Redfield's story following the events of Resident Evil 2. Claire is once again thrown into a terrifying situation, this time involving Rockford Island, the Ashford family, and some very familiar faces from the franchise. According to claims from Dusk Golem, the Code Veronica remake is already fairly far into development, which would suggest that the project is in a relatively good condition. There are also claims that Capcom could be making some significant changes to the original game. One of the more interesting rumors is that Claire could spend much more time traveling around Rockford Island using a motorcycle. And if you've played the original Code Veronica, you'll know exactly why this could make sense. Rockford Island is a surprisingly large location, and a modern remake could take advantage of that by making the island feel much more interconnected and explorable. Instead of simply moving between separate areas, Capcom could potentially create a much larger environment where Claire has more freedom to explore. If done properly, that could make the remake feel much bigger than the original. And considering how Capcom has expanded the environments in recent Resident Evil games, I wouldn't be surprised if Code of Veronica Remake receives a similar treatment. Next, we have the Resident Evil Requiem DLC. According to the current rumors, the DLC was originally expected to release sometime in September 2026, but Capcom may have decided to move its release depending on the performance of Code Veronica Remake. The idea here is pretty interesting. Capcom could potentially wait to see how well Code Veronica performs commercially before deciding exactly when to release the DLC. If Code Veronica performs extremely well, Capcom could potentially hold the DLC back and release it later, possibly sometime in 2027. However, if the remake doesn't perform as expected, Capcom could choose to release the DLC much sooner. The reasoning would be fairly simple. If the game underperforms, the DLC could help generate additional attention and potentially recover some of the revenue. Of course, this is speculation based on current reports, so take it with a healthy amount of salt. As for the actual content of the DLC, this is where things become even more interesting. The DLC is reportedly connected to Leon S. Kennedy. One possibility is that the DLC could focus on Leon's life after the events of Resident Evil 6, showing us what happened to him and potentially exploring how his character has changed over the years. Another claim suggests that the DLC could focus on Grace and Leon, potentially exploring their future and expanding the story introduced in Resident Evil Requiem. But there is another possibility that I find particularly interesting. The DLC could potentially explore Xeno, including how he was created and how he obtained Albert Wesker's powers. If that's true, then the DLC could answer some of the biggest questions surrounding the story. And honestly, there are so many possibilities here that it's difficult to know which direction Capcom will actually take. After that, we have Resident Evil 0 Remake. And this is where the story goes back to beginning. Resident Evil 0 takes place before the original Resident Evil, so a remake would give Capcom the opportunity to completely rebuild one of the earliest stories in the timeline using modern technology. The current rumors suggest that Resident Evil 0 Remake could be targeting 2028. Interestingly, according to Dusk Golem, Resident Evil 0 Remake was reportedly further ahead in development than Code Veronica Remake at one point. However, Capcom apparently decided to release Code Veronica first. And that raises a very interesting question. Why? If Resident Evil 0 was further along, why would Capcom change the order? Something may have happened during development, or Capcom may simply have decided that Code Veronica made more sense as the next remake. Whatever the reason, Resident Evil 0 could still be one of the most challenging projects for Capcom. The original game uses a camera system that can feel quite restrictive by modern standards. And if you've played Resident Evil 0, you already know that its camera angles can sometimes make exploration and combat unnecessarily difficult. difficult. A remake would therefore need to completely rethink how the game handles camera positioning, environments, and movement. Capcom would essentially have to modernize almost every aspect of the experience while still maintaining what made Resident Evil 0 unique, and with the modern Resident Evil engine. The potential is massive. Then we have something even more exciting, Resident Evil 1 Remake. The current rumors suggest that this could arrive around 2029, with pre-production reportedly already underway. That means Capcom could already be planning how to rebuild the game that started the entire franchise. And if this remake really happens, I think Jill Valentine will obviously be one of the most important characters involved. Imagine returning to the Spencer Mansion with the technology Capcom has today. The mansion could be significantly larger, more detailed, and more atmospheric. The puzzles could be redesigned, the zombies could be more terrifying, and the entire location could feel like a real, interconnected place. And considering what Capcom has achieved with its recent Resident Evil games, a modern Resident Evil 1 remake could be absolutely incredible. Resident Evil 10, and finally, we have Resident Evil 10, which is currently rumored for around 2030. Obviously, we're talking about a game that is still years away, so almost everything about it remains uncertain. But according to the current roadmap, Resident Evil 10 would take place after the events of Resident Evil 9, and importantly, its story could depend heavily on what happens in the Resident Evil 9 DLC. That makes sense because Resident Evil 9 appears to leave plenty of questions unanswered. Where is Chris Redfield? What exactly is going on with Xeno? And how did Xeno obtain those incredible powers connected to Albert Wesker? These are the kinds of questions that could potentially become major story points in the next mainline game. And there's even speculation that Chris Redfield could return as the protagonist of Resident Evil 10. Personally, I think that would be a very interesting direction for the franchise. Chris has been one of the central characters of Resident Evil for decades, and giving him another major role in the next chapter could provide a great way to connect the older generation of Resident Evil characters with the newer storyline. Final thoughts. So, if this roadmap turns out to be accurate, Capcom could potentially give us a new major Resident Evil experience almost every year. Code Veronica remake in 2027. Resident Evil 0 remake Resident Evil 1 remake in 2029, and potentially Resident Evil 10 in 2030. That's an absolutely packed future for Resident Evil fans. Of course, we need to remember that these are rumors and reports, and Capcom can change its plans at any time. But if even half of this roadmap turns out to be true, the future of Resident Evil looks incredibly interesting. We've got remakes, DLC, new characters, returning characters, and potentially the continuation of some of the franchise's biggest storylines. And honestly, Capcom might have enough Resident Evil projects planned to keep us busy for years. But what do you think? Which Resident Evil game are you most excited to see next? Would you rather get Code Veronica Remake, Resident Evil 0 Remake, Resident Evil 1 Remake, or are you more interested in seeing what Resident Evil 10 does with the story? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe for more Resident Evil news, rumors, and updates. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.